There are moments in life that split time into two halves, before and after. For me, that moment came on a quiet Thursday evening at my own dinner table, when a man I had not seen in 11 years walked through my front door, looked at my face, turned the color of ash, and screamed. But to understand why that scream shook the walls of my house, and why it shattered the life my husband had spent years building, you need to go back to where it all began. You need to understand who I was before I became invisible. My name is Alina. 6 years ago, I married a man named Daniel. In the beginning, he made me feel like the center of his universe. He would hold my hand across restaurant tables and tell strangers, unprompted, that he had married the smartest woman he knew. I believed him. I believed every word because love makes you generous with your trust. I had once been someone with ambitions of my own. Before Daniel, before marriage, I had a small career in finance, quiet but promising. But when we married, Daniel suggested I stay home, just for a while, just until his career stabilized. 1 year became 3. 3 became 6. Somewhere in that stretch of time, I stopped being Alina, the woman with a mind of her own, and became simply Daniel's wife, the one who cooked, who cleaned, who waited. At first, I told myself this was a season, not a sentence. I told myself that love sometimes asks us to shrink for a while, and that shrinking is not the same as disappearing. I was wrong. Slowly, so slowly that I almost didn't notice it happening, the man who once introduced me with pride began to introduce me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Daniel worked at a mid-sized investment firm, climbing the ladder rung by rung, and as he climbed, something in him changed. He began correcting the way I spoke at dinner parties. He began sighing when I offered an opinion about markets or numbers, as though I couldn't possibly understand something as complicated as his world. Once, at a work event, when I mentioned an economic trend I had read about, one of his colleagues raised his eyebrows in surprise. Daniel had laughed a little too quickly and said, "Don't worry, she read that in a magazine somewhere." The table laughed with him. I smiled too, because that is what you do when you are trying to survive inside your own marriage. You smile. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that as long as he loved me, the rest was just noise. But love, I would learn, is not only about affection. It is about respect. And respect was the one thing that had quietly, invisibly, been leaving our home for years. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Daniel came home one evening, practically glowing, and told me his boss, Richard Bennett, was finally going to visit our house for dinner. Richard Bennett was not just any boss. He was the man who held Daniel's entire future in his hands, the man who could approve his next promotion, the man whose good opinion Daniel had been chasing for 3 years. "This dinner has to be perfect," Daniel told me, packing our kitchen floor. "Richard's old-fashioned. He likes to see a man's home life, his family, his stability. I need you to be there. I need you to look presentable." Something about the way he said, "presentable," made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't yet explain why. In the days before the dinner, Daniel began coaching me the way you might train someone for a performance. "Don't talk too much about your old job," he said. "Keep it simple. Richard likes women who know how to run a home, not women who think they know business. He'll ask polite questions, just smile and let me answer." I remember standing in front of the mirror the night before that dinner, staring at a woman I barely recognized. She had dimmed her own light so completely, folded herself so small, that she had almost vanished entirely into someone else's shadow. I didn't know yet that the next evening, a stranger from my past was about to walk through my door and see the woman I used to be, still alive underneath all that quiet, and that his reaction would change the direction of my entire life. I had no idea, as I set the table with careful hands that night, that I was not walking into an evening of humiliation. I was walking into the beginning of my own reckoning. The night of the dinner, I wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention, exactly as Daniel had asked. I made a roast, the kind of meal that says stability and warmth without saying too much of anything else. Daniel walked around the house before the guests arrived, adjusting picture frames, checking that nothing looked out of place, glancing at me now, and then the way you'd glance at furniture you hoped wouldn't embarrass you. "Remember," he said, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror, Just smile and let the men talk business. Richard likes a woman who knows her place." I remember nodding, swallowing the small, sharp thing rising in my throat. I had learned, over the years, how to swallow those things quickly, before they could turn into tears or worse, into words I wasn't allowed to say. The doorbell rang at exactly 7. Daniel practically ran to answer it, his voice already shifting into that warm, eager tone he used only for people who could do something for him. I heard him greeting Richard Bennett in the hallway, laughing at something, guiding him toward the dining room where I stood, waiting, dish towel still in my hand. "Richard, I want you to meet my wife," Daniel said, stepping aside with a small, almost mocking flourish, as though presenting a piece of furniture. "She doesn't know much about the business world, but she makes a wonderful roast." The room I remember filled with the smell of thyme and butter, the soft clinking of Daniel pouring wine, the low murmur of polite laughter from Daniel's colleague and his wife who had arrived with him. And then Richard Bennett stepped into the doorway of my dining room, and the world tilted sideways. I recognized him instantly. 11 years is a long time, but some faces do not fade, especially the ones tied to the worst chapter of your life. Richard Bennett had once been my father's business partner. My father, Thomas Hale, had built a modest textile company from nothing, working double shifts for 2 decades to give our family something to stand on. Richard had come into that business smooth-talking and confident, promising to help my father expand, promising loyalty in exchange for trust. He had taken both and given nothing back. When the company's finances collapsed under mysterious, unexplained losses, my father was the one left holding the blame, the one whose name was dragged through supplier meetings and small-town gossip, while Richard quietly walked away with money that was never his to take. My father never recovered, not financially, and not in his health. He passed away 3 years after the company folded, his heart worn down by stress and shame that never should have been his to carry. I was 24 when I watched my father's world collapse, and I had never forgotten the man responsible for it. And now here he stood, in my dining room, wearing an expensive suit and a practiced smile, about to sit at my table as my husband's boss. For a moment, I said nothing. I simply looked at him, letting him see my face fully, the way you might let sunlight fall on something you want someone else to finally notice. And I watched the exact second recognition hit him. His smile did not fade slowly. It collapsed all at once, like a building giving way. The wine glass in his hand trembled. His face went the color of old paper, pale and drained, and then, without warning, he let out a short, sharp scream, stumbling half a step backward into the doorway. "You," he said, his voice cracking, "you're your Thomas Hale's daughter." The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like all the air had been pulled out of it at once. Daniel's colleague and his wife stared, frozen mid-laugh. Daniel himself turned to look at me, his confusion sliding slowly into something like alarm. "Elena," Daniel said carefully, "what is he talking about?" But I did not answer him. Not yet. Because in that moment, watching Richard Bennett's composure crumble in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress, I realized something that would change the rest of that evening and the rest of my life. I was no longer the woman Daniel had shrunk down to fit into his image of a perfect, quiet wife. I was Thomas Hale's daughter, and I had spent 11 years quietly becoming someone Richard Bennett should have been afraid of. What none of them knew, not Daniel, not Richard, not the guests standing frozen in my dining room, was that I had never stopped fighting for my father's name. And that fight was about to walk straight through their perfect evening. I should have seen it coming, the way Richard's fear did not fade even after he composed himself. Fear like that does not vanish. It only hides, waiting to see how much danger it's truly in. He sat down at the table because Daniel, flustered and desperate to smooth things over, insisted everyone just relax and enjoy the meal. But Richard barely touched his food. His eyes kept flicking toward me, the way a man watches a door he suspects might not stay closed. Daniel, for his part, spent the rest of dinner shooting me confused, almost accusing glances, as though my past were some kind of inconvenience I had deliberately hidden to embarrass him. Later that night, after the guests left, he rounded on me in the kitchen, his voice tight with anger disguised as concern. "Do you understand what you might have just done to my career?" he said. Richard looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What is going on, Alina? Who was your father to him?" I told him. Calmly, without tears, without the trembling voice I might have used years earlier when I still needed his approval. I told him about my father's company, about the years of hard work poured into something that Richard Bennett had hollowed out from the inside, about the losses that were never explained, about the shame that followed my father to his grave. Daniel's reaction was not what I expected. He did not reach for me, did not apologize for the years of subtle humiliation, for introducing me as a woman who only knew how to make a good roast. Instead, his first concern, his only concern, was his own position. "This can't come out," he said. "Not now, not when I'm this close to a promotion. Whatever happened between your father and Richard, it has nothing to do with us." That sentence, "it has nothing to do with us," became the moment everything inside me went still and clear, like water settling after a storm. For years I had absorbed his careless comments, his casual belittling, telling myself it was simply his way, that beneath it he still loved me. But watching him stand in our kitchen, more afraid of losing his boss's favor than curious about the pain his own wife had carried silently for over a decade, I understood the truth. Daniel had never really seen me as a partner. He had seen me as a background character in the story of his own success, useful as long as I stayed quiet and small. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to control the situation the only way he knew how, through damage control. He called Richard, smoothing things over, assuring him that whatever history existed between our families was ancient, irrelevant, nothing to worry about. He came home each night more anxious, watching me carefully, as though worried I might do something to disrupt the fragile peace he was trying to rebuild. But what he did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had never stopped documenting what happened to my father's company. In the years after his death, grief had turned into something quieter and more disciplined. I had gone back to my old skills in finance, teaching myself to read filings and shell company structures the way other people read novels, piecing together, slowly and carefully, exactly how Richard Bennett had drained my father's business. I had spent years collecting records, bank transfers, falsified invoices, testimonies from 2 former employees who had always suspected foul play, but had been too afraid to speak up while Richard still held power in our small industry circle. I had never used any of it, because for a long time I told myself that revenge would not bring my father back, that maybe the healthiest thing was to let it go. But sitting in my kitchen that night, listening to my husband worry more about his promotion than about the truth, I realized that letting go and disappearing were not the same thing. I had let go of anger. I had never let go of the truth. And now, that truth had a new audience. Richard Bennett was no longer just my father's old business partner hiding in comfortable anonymity. He was Daniel's boss, a senior executive at a respected investment firm, a man whose reputation mattered more now than it ever had, which meant the smallest crack in his past could bring down everything he had built. I began making calls. Quiet ones, careful ones, exactly the kind of moves Richard himself might have made once, when he was busy stripping my father's life apart. I reached out to the 2 former employees who had seen the fraud unfold. I contacted a financial journalist I had once worked alongside years earlier, a woman known for her patient, thorough investigations into corporate misconduct. And I reached out to the compliance department at Richard's own firm, presenting myself not as an angry daughter, but as a former financial analyst with documented evidence of fraud committed by one of their senior leaders. Daniel had no idea what I was doing in the weeks that followed. He assumed my silence was simply me moving past an awkward evening, retreating into the quiet, agreeable version of myself he had grown used to. He should have known better. Sometimes the quietest people are quiet because they are building something, not because they have nothing left to say. 2 weeks after that dinner, everything I had built finally moved into motion, and there was no version of that evening Richard Bennett could smooth over anymore. The compliance investigation moved faster than I expected, partly because the evidence I provided was thorough, and partly because it turned out I was not the only person who had once been hurt by Richard Bennett. When the journalist I had contacted began quietly digging, she uncovered 2 other small businesses Richard had approached over the years with the exact same pattern: generous promises, quiet manipulation of the books, and a graceful exit once the damage was done, leaving other people to absorb the wreckage of decisions he had made. The firm launched a formal internal review. Word moves quickly in corporate circles, and within days, hushed conversations were happening in break rooms and hallways about the senior executive suddenly on leave pending investigation. Daniel came home one evening pale in a way that mirrored Richard's own reaction weeks earlier, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. "They're investigating Richard," he said, packing the living room floor. "There's talk that it's connected to something from years ago. Alina, please tell me this doesn't have anything to do with you." I looked at him, calm in a way that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. "It has everything to do with me," I said. "And it has everything to do with my father, whose name was destroyed so Richard Bennett could keep his." Daniel's face shifted through several emotions in quick succession: disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. "Do you understand what this could do to my career? If people think my wife orchestrated an attack on my own boss?" "I didn't attack anyone," I said quietly. "I told the truth, the same truth you told me had nothing to do with us." He had no response for that. For the first time in years, I watched my husband stand in front of me without a single clever thing to say, without a joke to soften the moment, without a way to make himself the reasonable one in the room. The investigation confirmed everything the 2 former employees, and I already knew. Richard Bennett had falsified financial records, not just with my father's company, but with at least one other small business years later, transferring funds into shell accounts under the guise of consulting fees that were never rendered. Within a month, he was formally removed from his position, his name quietly but permanently erased from the firm's leadership page. The financial journalist's article ran shortly after, detailed and unflinching, laying out the pattern of manipulation that had, for over a decade, gone unpunished. For my father, it was 11 years too late, but watching that article confirm, in cold, public print, what our family had always known in private, gave me something I had not expected, not triumph exactly, but a kind of peace. The truth, finally, was no longer just mine to carry alone. Daniel's own position at the firm did not survive the fallout either. Executives who had built their rise on Richard's favor found themselves suddenly without a patron, and in the reshuffling that followed, Daniel was quietly passed over for the promotion he had been chasing for years, then let go entirely during a round of what the company called restructuring. I watched him come home those weeks, the confidence that had once made him mock me at dinner tables slowly draining out of him, replaced by the same fragile uncertainty he had once dismissed so easily in me. It would be simple to say I felt joy watching that unravel, but the truth is quieter and more complicated than that. I did not destroy Daniel's career. I simply stopped protecting a lie, and the structure that lie had been holding up collapsed under its own weight. Daniel had built his sense of self on being close to power, on being the kind of man whose wife stayed small so he could stand tall. When the power he clung to disappeared, he had nothing solid left underneath him. We separated not long after. There was no dramatic final fight, no shouting match to close out 6 years of marriage. Just a quiet conversation one evening where I told him I was done shrinking myself for someone who had never once tried to see me fully. He didn't argue. Perhaps some part of him had known, long before that dinner, that I was more than the woman he had introduced with a smirk and a joke about roast chicken. As for me, I moved back into the world I had once set aside. A former colleague, impressed by the way I had built a case against Richard Bennett using nothing but patience and careful research, offered me a position at a financial consulting firm, helping small business owners protect themselves from exactly the kind of fraud that had destroyed my father. It felt, in a strange and quiet way, like coming home to a version of myself I had left waiting for over a decade. I think often about the moment Richard Bennett walked through my dining room door and screamed at the sight of my face. At the time, it felt like the most humiliating, chaotic moment of that entire evening. Now I understand it differently. That scream was not the sound of my life falling apart. It was the sound of the truth finally being seen, after 11 years of being buried beneath other people's comfort. I am no longer the woman who stood quietly in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, waiting to be spoken over. I carry my father's name forward now, not as a wound, but as something I fought to restore. And if there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to understand, it is simply this: the people who try hardest to make you small are often the ones most afraid of how powerful you would become if you finally remembered your own worth.